Hi everyone, and welcome back to Series 2 of the Pager podcast. We've got some great episodes to share with you, kicking off today with a far-reaching interview with Dr. Vinay Prasad. Dr. Prasad is a haematologist, oncologist and associate professor of medicine at the University of California in San Francisco. He also hosts the podcast Plenary Session, which I recommend checking out, and he has a keen interest in designing better clinical trials and policies in the pharmaceutical sector. These are exactly the topics which we pick up on in this episode. We discuss everything from financial conflict of interests, distorted incentives, drug approval policies, medical education, and what this all means for patient care at the end of the day. We hope you enjoy it. Vinay, welcome to the podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you with me today. I've heard quite a lot of your voice, I think, over the last few months listening to your podcast. You've probably heard none of mine. For those who don't know Plenary Session, it goes over all sorts of ways in which many clinical trials are, in fact, rigged to succeed and indeed mislead. But I'd like to kind of start a bit by just asking how we've got to this stage, because I think one thing that lots of your work has really exposed to me is the idea that it doesn't necessarily take somebody who's a complete expert in the field to see some of the glaring issues that are pervasive in lots of the clinical trials that are published. So how have we got to this stage, do you think?
I guess, my interest is I'm a cancer doctor and I study cancer medicines primarily, but I'm interested kind of more broadly in making better medical decisions. And I think the way in which we've ended up where we are is that since the early 1990s to the present day, there has been tremendous lobbying on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry to create an environment that is extremely favorable for drug development, where the regulatory hurdle to approve drugs is as low as possible, but not so low that you actually flood the market with entrants. It's high enough that it actually eliminates some very small firms from being able to compete, but it is not so high that it actually demands drugs improve survival and quality of life. It's something in between. So it's really the sweet spot for profits, which is you have several hurdles to jump through. Not everyone can jump through those hurdles, but the folks that do jump through those hurdles are able to command large prices. But those hurdles are not so high that they really require drugs to be transformational or often even good.
How much should a clinician on the ground actually think about these sorts of problems and the issues with clinical trials and the issues with the evidence with which they're acting upon? And how do they kind of balance that with practice?
Yeah, I guess I would say that I wish we lived in a world where the average practicing clinician could trust guidelines that were given to them, could have faith that experts in certain diseases were making the best medical decisions and empowering them with the best information. I fear we don't live in that world. I fear we live in a world where the experts are deeply conflicted with the companies. The mantra is always more drugs earlier, sooner, and longer, where the average practicing clinician may be the only downward force in the system that actually demands that our drugs, our devices, our procedures do what we wish they did. Fear we don't live in that world where the regulators encourage the interests of the companies, where the average practicing physicians need to do some of that hard work of evidence interpretation.
And certainly one thing which I think some people might find a bit, let's say revolutionary, is this idea that pharmaceutical industry shouldn't be running its own trials and that we should move it over to independent investigators. And what would be the merits of this, the main kind of core features that make this a good plan going forwards, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I would say first we have to be very honest about the current system. So what is the current system? If I'm a pharmaceutical company and I'm developing a drug and I want US FDA approval, I typically go to the FDA and I negotiate some terms of a trial, rough negotiation of the trial. I then run the trial for $30, $40, $50 million. I run the study. Then I go to the FDA with the report of the trial, the primary individual patient level data, and I give that to the FDA along with $2.6 million in user fees. I give them this. And then I say, you decide if the drug should be approved. What I'm suggesting is not a big departure. Instead of giving money and data to the FDA, why don't you give a little bit more money and give the drug and let the FDA design and conduct the study? The FDA can contract it out to the same clinical research organizations that the industry contracts it out to. The FDA can decide the comparator, the dose, the line, the setting, in discussion with non-conflicted experts. And so I guess what I would say is the current design and conduct of clinical studies is in the hands of the entity that will make tens of billions of dollars if that p-value is 0.049. and they will make negative $50 million if it's 0.051. And as long as you put that decision making in the hands of somebody who is so fundamentally conflicted, the temptation to put a thumb on the scale will be incredible and difficult to resist.
What has kind of brought you to the stage where you think that this isn't solvable just by increasing the bar for approvals of new drugs, and actually being a little bit more strict on how pharmaceutical companies design their trials as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I would say because with each passing year, I discover new ways in which trials are trying to trick me. So it's simple. You could start by saying, okay, let's make sure they measure the right endpoint, survival and quality of life. Let's make sure they're randomized controlled trials. Let's make sure they're double blinded. Let's make sure they have adequate concealment. Okay, well then they're going to say, we're going to start to play with the competitor. We'll compare our drug against the weakest drug on the market, a straw man competitor. Then you say, okay, fine, we're going to fix that. We're going to make you choose the competitor that's actually what we're doing. They say, okay, fine. Then we're going to play with the drug dosing schema. Our drug is going to go from 100% to 75% to 50% with dose reductions. The competitor will go from 100% to 66% to 33%. Then you'll say, okay, well, we can't have that. So now we're going to fix that drug dosing. Then they'll say, okay, well, we'll do a double drug run-in period. And then you say, okay, well, we'll fix that. And I guess what I wish to suggest is you will always be chasing them. There's always a way in which one can add a quirk to a trial that will favor one arm that you have not thought of aforementioned, that you have not thought of beforehand. And the only way to ensure that trials actually ask reasonable questions is for somebody who doesn't have skin in the game to design those trials, somebody who really wants what's best for patients. And so I think that sometimes you can't regulate your way out of a problem because people will always find the loophole.
And this seems to bring up, I had this idea in my mind that actually there are kind of a number of different types of trials in a way. If you, and obviously it's a sliding scale, but there are the trials that actually provide good, high quality data for patients. If you take, I know you've talked about the recovery trial, for example. And then there are, at the other end of the spectrum, there are useless trials that provide no real usable information on the ground. And then kind of in the middle, there are these trials that perhaps provide slightly useful information, but that could maybe lead to some action, but in reality could be a lot better. Do you think that's something that needs to be clamped down on? Not just trials being kind of abjectly awful, but trials that could have been better and almost in that sense can be seen as a bit of a waste of patients' time and resources, for example, when they could have been producing much better results, but yet are still passable, for example, for drug approval.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think we have a moral obligation not just to offer okay trials, but to offer the best trials. Think of what we're asking someone. We're asking a human being to take an experimental drug, a surgery, a procedure, something unproven. We're asking them to do that. And they're making sort of a social contract with society that they're doing that because they believe that their information will contribute to knowledge. I don't think it's good enough to just have a mediocre trial or a trial with serious limitations that may or may not actually mean the drug is beneficial if you actually use it in clinical practice. I think you have to have really good trials like recovery trial. You have to have trials that actually tell us what we need to know. We're having human beings make a sacrifice. We can't settle for mediocrity. And if you're really honest, why do we settle for mediocrity? We're not settling for mediocrity because we don't know what the right trial design is. Nobody knows. It's very difficult. We're settling for mediocrity because the sponsor has billions of dollars at stake. And that to me is not a good enough reason. Societal interest trumps the sponsor's interest for return on investment any day of the week. And that might be the most controversial view I take, which is I think a lot of people view it differently. They think we need to incentivize these companies. And I do agree. They should be heavily incentivized to do good studies and come up with transformational drugs. They should be disincentivized to do lousy studies that come up with marginal drugs.
I think there's this overly simplistic argument that if you increase the bar for getting drugs in, you won't get as many drugs and things like that, whereas actually it ignores the reality that we're not interested in things that don't have good evidence to back them up and are harmful towards patients. Just an increase in the numbers of drug approved isn't necessarily the best way forwards. But actually it's interesting that over the last few months we've seen another, and I think some people might describe it as an excuse for what is in many cases mediocrity in trials, which is this idea of kind of exceptionalism in medical research in COVID-19, that actually we need speed and that can come at the expense of high quality data. What are your thoughts on this? And do you think it's gone too far, or do you think we've got the balance right?
Well, I think I'm going to think it's gone too far. I guess I would say that you're absolutely right that there are some simplistic narratives that are offered in this space. One of the simplistic narratives is that we have to choose between speed and knowledge. We've done a number of empirical studies that show that as you sacrifice knowledge and increase uncertainty, you don't speed things up as much as you think. In fact, in some cases, it actually might take you longer, paradoxically. You don't even see that. People don't even consider that. Because it turns out when you have highly lethal conditions, which COVID-19 is, which cancer often is, sometimes doing a randomized control trial with the primary endpoint of overall survival is actually faster than measuring response rate and median duration of response in the subgroup of people who are responders in cancer clinical trials. It's actually faster to do the right study. We sacrifice uncertainty not for speed typically. We sacrifice uncertainty for market access. Uncertainty means more drugs come to market and they're more lucrative. The other fallacy you alluded to is higher bar dissuades innovation. I don't think that's the case. A high bar dissuades lousy drugs that don't actually improve survival, but it may incentivize the industry to retool the entire R&D pipeline to chase transformational drugs, which is what we want more of. It may actually lead to greater years of life gained in society. I think it's very difficult to know the answer to that question, but of course, economists, especially those who are consulting for the industry, love to offer that argument.
This kind of whole discussion, a lot of it is geared around this conflict of interest, and particularly financial conflict of interest here. And I think it's fair to say that bar a few roles around the world, such as, I know, on some journal boards and regulators, for example, it's currently seen as enough to just declare conflict of interests. And I'm wondering, in this situation, what your thoughts are on how we should actually act upon when you see the conflict of interest list at the bottom of a paper, for example, and you read through it and it's 10 lines long. How should we actually act upon this in how we view that evidence there? Because it doesn't seem to be kind of a clear answer for me doing this.
Yeah, I guess I would say that you've articulated, I think, the fundamental problem, which is that disclosure is not the solution to conflict of interest. Divestment is, and recusal is. The reality is, why is there so much conflict in biomedicine? And it's because doctors have long enjoyed high levels of public trust and respect. We are the most trusted profession, typically in surveys, or among the most trusted professions. And we get a lot of leeway as a result. And all of the people who are in positions of power in biomedicine, they are among the people who have the greatest financial conflict. It would be natural for them not to want to change the system. Every single person wants more money. I've never met anybody, no matter how high they're being paid, who ever said, I don't want to raise. And I find that fascinating. But people want more money, and this is a way to get more money. What it fundamentally means is that you're placed in a dual role that is untenable. You cannot be both a true impartial advocate for patients and be taking money from a company that only makes billions if they recommend more drug. I think it's a fundamental tension. Disclosure is a token measure. And let's be honest, we don't even have real disclosure. In a study we did, we looked at how long the disclosure slides were flashed at the national meeting. 38% were flashed faster than human beings can read. That's an empty token measure. We're not really disclosing. We don't really care. And the reason we don't care is the people who are positioned to fix that problem are receiving the most money. So it would be natural that they don't want to do anything about it. The people who are junior, who are just starting their career, who have no conflicts, these people have no power to change the system. And I think that's the fundamental imbalance here. I think medicine will never self-regulate. It must be regulated externally by policymakers. In the US, we have the Sunshine Law that has mandatory disclosure. That was passed by Congress. It wasn't passed by the American Doctors Association or any organization like that. Congress, people will have to legislate doctors and say, you can't prescribe Celgene drugs in the gray zone and take consulting payments from Celgene. That is untenable. Just like the prosecutor can't receive money from the defendant in a court case. It's a simple separation of financial conflicts.
Absolutely. And we've got a system, well, not quite like that, but more of a voluntary system. I think that's gaining more traction in the UK. I think Who Pays My Doc there. And yes. It's interesting, actually, the comparison to legal conflict, because I think there's been this argument that, we should pay barristers and lawyers more money so that they are less easily bribed. But then again, your point that you alluded to about that people will always want more money, and I think pharma will always be able to pay more money. And if you have, I think just paying people more, and clearly in America doctors are very well paid, and actually just paying people more to lure them into non-conflicted positions isn't necessarily a viable solution to it.
No, I guess I to some degree sympathize with that view that we should pay people more. But which people should we pay more? In American medicine, I wouldn't pay cancer center directors anymore. I wouldn't pay deans anymore. I wouldn't pay full professors anymore. I would pay the people who are underpaid, instructors. So you have somebody who's in their late 30s often, and they're an indefinite instructor making slightly more than they made as a fellow. I would pay that person a little bit more. I would pay assistant professors a little bit more. I would potentially pay people or incentivize them financially to be non-conflicted. For instance, if you want to be on the editorial board of our journal, and maybe that will come some monetary compensation, we will only accept you if you're non-conflicted. Maybe when you peer review articles, there could be some payments for peer review. Maybe if you write editorials, some of these publishing houses are highly lucrative, making 40% profit on revenue. Maybe there should be some incentive. So I guess I think money can be used in a good way too to incentivize the right behavior. But I don't know enough about barristers in the UK. But my understanding is that doctors in the UK, some of them are underpaid, and maybe they ought to be paid higher. And my understanding is in Europe, people tell me if I didn't take pharmaceutical money, I couldn't go to the conference. Literally, I cannot go. And I think the problem there is you have to have a system where doctors can go to maybe not 10 conferences, but maybe 2 conferences to keep up with the knowledge without having to take industry spoils.
When we're talking about conflicts of interest, we're not always talking about just financial conflicts of interest. We're talking about publications, we're talking about faculty positions as well. And even the least financially conflicted doctor can still be motivated by getting a positive result in a trial, because that can mean, and then for example, in a New England publication, that could mean quite serious positive effects for their career there. Is that something that we are physically going to be able to target, or should we just accept that actually, perhaps in trials, one casualty of the system is that people will be motivated to have positive trials whatever happens? Or is there any way to lessen this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I guess I put it to you this way. There are lots of carcinogens out there, no doubt about that. Lots of things increase or decrease your risk of cancer. Smoking, asbestos, industrial pollutants, and then a lot of things that people debate heavily. Obesity, eating 1 strip of bacon once a month, drinking 2 glasses of beer a day. I mean, these are things that are heavily disputed. And I guess what I would say is financial conflict of interest is the cigarette smoking of cancer. It's been indisputably linked to bias. There's a net vector of bias. It's always towards doing more early, faster, sooner, more drugs, more costs, more. That's the direction. It's been shown in 200, 300, 400 publications. It's been meta-analyzed. It's been studied every which way. It affects, cost effectiveness analyses. It affects design and conduct of studies. It affects everything. It's the tobacco of smoking. It's the tobacco of carcinogens. We should get rid of it. We should have policies that minimize it. Once we do that, will we learn that there's an asbestos? Will we learn that there's a bacon? Will we learn that there's an alcohol? It's possible. I don't know the answer, but I do know that intellectual conflicts of interest have long been touted as very important. We really do not have as good empirical evidence to show that that's the case. And we also don't have clear ideas and strategies to tackle them. So one instance is, there may be a bias among an investigator who's doing PI3 kinase research to have a PI3 kinase drug succeed. But there may be another investigator who's got an axe to grind against PI3 kinase, thinks it's a useless pathway and it's not important, and they may have an axe to grind to publish research to show it fails. So I guess what I say is, in the financial bias world, companies only make money from new drugs, PI3 kinase inhibitors. Nobody's making money from shorting PI3 kinase inhibitors and doing trials to debunk them. That's not a financial strategy in the system. So it's a unidirectional bias. If it's intellectual, it's possible there's 2 biases. The truth is, I guess I've not seen good studies to convince me which way it goes. People want findings that are publishable. I agree with you there. It's likely that discovery is more publishable than debunking, but it's possible debunking has a role as well. But I guess what I would say, my fundamental point is that I believe there are other carcinogens, there are other biases, but I don't understand why you would not tackle cigarette smoking. This is like 1950s UK and US. Everyone is smoking, and everyone's saying we need to stop smoking. You're causing a lot of cancer. And people are saying, well, but maybe eating bacon is bad too. So let's puff away. It's illogical to me.
And certainly in a system as complex as this, the idea that we should have a perfect fix for everything and this perfect new landscape that we can just roll out there straight away, and that's all or nothing, I think is a bit silly. And another example I was thinking of was the idea of I don't think it's prevalent in the UK, but certainly in the States, if as a doctor you are so conflicted that you can get a cut of money from the drugs that you prescribe, from the value of the drugs that you prescribe to a particular patient, which strikes me as quite low-hanging fruit in this case.
Yeah, we do have a system that does that, yeah.
Another interesting point you brought up was this idea that actually, which I think is very important to drive home, that good evidence is not necessarily about showing what is new and showing new discoveries. It's also about, as you've written, about medical reversal, showing what is harmful and also replicating. I think replicating studies certainly falls into the category of underfunded and much less prestigious than perhaps it should be for the benefits that it can bring to society and for patients all around. So perhaps we kind of need to think how our resources are divided up a bit better there. What are your thoughts on this?
Let's just take the US. At a federal government level in the United States, we spend at least $1 trillion on healthcare. It's likely that hundreds of billions of dollars are spent on unproven healthcare. And what's the fraction of spending we spend on clinical trials to test those unproven practices? It's in the orders of $10 billion, something like that. The ratio of spending hundreds of billions each year and having a tiny fraction of that used to test these things, that's an illogical ratio. A rational society would spend a lot more to test things because every time you find something doesn't work, you can save tens of billions of dollars, potentially. You can pay for your entire research agenda. Replication is something that's underfunded, undervalued. Doing good science is underfunded, undervalued. Finding things that don't work is not rewarded the same thing as being a discovery. I mean, if you just look at the prizes, the Nobel Prize always goes to someone who discovered something novel that led to a treatment. I'm not aware of a prize of the same caliber that goes to somebody who found that something we had been doing for decades didn't work. And that person might have done just as much good, a Bernie Fisher, for instance.
Do you know of any instances where, almost to turn the system we have on its head, a pharmaceutical company has launched a trial or investigation explicitly to try to disprove one of its competitors that is currently has a large market share? I wonder if that's ever happened.
Yes. So I guess I would say that it happens to some degree. So one example would be pazopanib versus sunitinib, a study funded by GlaxoSmithKline to carve out market share. But the company is very careful. They're not trying to prove the other drug is no better than placebo. They're trying to prove their drug is better than the other drug. And here it purports to be a comparative effectiveness study. But if you look at the detailed methodology, it's a non-inferiority study with a big margin. It has quality of life scales that are timed to favor the sponsor's product. So there are ways in which it's gamed. But this is unusual because drugs very rarely compete based on evidence. The reality is in cancer medicine, it's not evidence that leads to competition. Often it is marketing that leads to competition. The newer drug rolls in and has a message that it's better, well tolerated, better side effects, but it's never really rigorously shown. They just need to create that sort of cachet around the drug.
And that's really interesting because I know you've talked about it before, this idea that you'd think a non-inferiority trial actually meant non-inferiority, but actually there can be such a wide margin. It could be, say, 70% or something, where I think actually, particularly if the effect size is large, I mean, well, there were two different issues. If the effect size is large, then suddenly it could be a lot worse. And if the effect size is small, then both of them could be not very good and very expensive.
Well put, yes. Non-inferiority margins like a parallel parking spot. A good driver can park in a very tight spot, but anyone can park in a spot left by a school bus. That doesn't take any skill. But that's the majority of clinical trials. The margins are so big. It's like parallel parking where a school bus pulled out. So easy. You don't even have to back in. You just front in the car, It's not a test of skill, or it doesn't show anything about the drug.
And I wonder, what's your thoughts on how individuals see their system and see their role within this system? Because you certainly see a lot of people who have very prestigious faculty positions all around the world. They have a huge kind of reputation in medicine, but yet they can consistently run trials that actually you would look at, and certainly I would look at and feel slightly embarrassed to put my name on, given such kind of glaring either omissions or issues.
I think you are asking the great question, which is, why are the people who are so revered in medicine revered? Are they really smarter than other people? Are they really better trialists than other people? Or are they the people who have compromise the most with the industry and owe their career to the industry? Are they, I'm not going to use an impolite term, but there's some impolite terms that are used in this space. And I guess I would say that as a student, as a trainee, this is the question you have to do some soul searching on, which is, which doctor do you want to be like? Do you want to be like the doctor who has the biggest name for that cancer or that disease or that tumor type, or that, they're the biggest name, but when you really talk to them, they don't really have a position on these issues. They consistently cave to the industry interests. They actually don't write their own papers. They have medical writers write their papers. Is that role model? I think to this day, that's the majority of role models. I mean, that's the sad reality. I wish someday that there are other role models. There are people like, Ian Tannock, like Elizabeth Eisenhower, people who are brave thinkers who have pushed the field. I think we need different sets of role models.
There's certainly something to be said for professional reputation here, and doctors are very concerned with how their colleagues view them, but it seems like actually in a way could be disadvantageous in some cases, could actually be advantageous here into forcing people perhaps into a more ethical line in how they conduct research and how they do their work.
But I guess I would say we have to do the hard work. So how do we, when I was a fellow, how did I judge the reputation of a doctor? I looked and I saw, Dr. So-and-so is the author of 7 first author New England Journal papers. Wow, Dr. So-and-so is the expert in this tumor type. That's how I felt, because I had a very naive understanding. But it's natural. I mean, I don't blame myself. I mean, that's how I think we're taught. The doctor has published all these great papers. This must be the best doctor. I would say, you really want to know somebody? You really want to know if they're good or not? Read the papers that they must have written. Don't read the New England Journal articles. Read the commentaries with 1 or 2 authors. Read the articles that say there's no medical writer. Read a bunch of their papers. Think about what they're saying. Are they doing investigations that are not funded by the industry? There's some trialists who have their own research agenda. They do meta research on trials, observational studies. Those people, you can judge their work. There are a lot of trialists who just put their name on studies. They don't do any of that work. The more you actually read what people write, the more you realize that it's a lot of smoke and mirrors, that a lot of people's careers are built on nothing. They may be a okay doctor in that field, in the clinic, but they're not a leading thinker on trials and on medicine, and their reputation is overstated and is probably, I think, one of the great disappointments of my professional life, and some of my colleagues who call me on the phone, it's the realization that somebody we once admired is actually not very good. They're not very knowledgeable. But I do encourage, that's something that we all should do.
This brings up the interesting idea. You were talking about meta research and a particular kind of reviews as well that actually don't require, they require quite a lot of funding to get data sets and things like that, but orders of magnitude less than the funding required to test drug interventions and things like that. And we really, certainly amidst COVID-19, we've really seen a very lackluster, let's say, government and public response to actually testing interventions that have no potential profit behind them, but could bring huge benefits to society. Where do you think we're heading here? And how do you think we can, if there are opportunities for the pharmaceutical industry, it almost seems absurd to say there aren't opportunities for public institutions to do similar research.
Yes. I guess I would say that, kudos to the Oxford investigators for running a recovery trial. That's the right kind of study. Kudos to them for testing dexamethasone. In the US, we're testing some patented JAK2 inhibitor and remdesivir. We're basically serving as subsidizing the R&D portfolio of Gilead. That's what we're doing in the US. In your country, you're testing drugs that if they are successful, then everywhere, India, China, Africa, they can all use these drugs. When remdesivir is successful, what does the US do? We buy the supply of the drug for 3 months so no one else can get it.
At $520 a vial.
Yeah. This is shameful behavior of a pandemic. The research priorities of a nation define what the nation is contributing to the world. What is the nation's role in the world? The US has shown that we are capitulating to for-profit interests. What we're testing. What do I think is the real solution? The real solution is these politicians who year after year tell us that they are pro-science and pro-discovery. They appears to me to be pro-receiving contributions from pharmaceutical companies to their campaign. They're not really pro-science. If you're really pro-science, you would take the governmental budget of clinical trials in this country and you would make it 10 times bigger to run non-conflicted trials, to test unproven things, to reduce our healthcare spending, to answer important questions. We don't see an appetite for that. even in our left-leaning politicians, let alone our conservative politicians in this country. We have a failure here because the people who can put pressure on politicians, they're not in the right position to fully understand the issues. That's why I think this kind of stuff is important to educate people, and so that people can demand, I think, the best medical science.
I had a couple of thoughts on this, that actually dexamethasone was not a masterstroke. It was not somebody who came up with this light bulb moment and said, should we test this? It was something that actually people had thought about for a while with it. Are steroids good? Perhaps, kudos for the motivation to actually study it, but also having a system in place which offered you funding to do that and offered you the opportunities to do that is very important. And my second thought was on the idea that we do need regulatory and kind of government action to solve some of these problems. And do you think that perhaps this is something that would benefit from a far wider movement than is just happening in the medical profession? Do you think actually there's some merit in actually promoting even more outrage? Because it really is outrageous, some of the things that are going on amongst a far larger swathe of the population, in order to really put pressure on legislators to do something about this.
No, you're right. You're right. I mean, this is something that you need buy-in from. To be honest with you, like what your question makes me think, like, why do I personally bother with any of this? Why do I bother with making a podcast and have a YouTube channel? Why do I bother with writing papers? I could probably get by, in my career by doing no social media and write like 3 papers a year. I could probably hang on to my existence, right? The only thing that motivates me is that I might persuade you, and you might persuade your colleague, and then you might become a persuader and you persuade some other people. But I think you're right. We have to build sort of coalitions of people. I personally believe that, the answer is going to come from you, your generation, people who are medical students now. You have not yet been tainted and corrupted by all of the pitfalls of modern medicine. You have enough idealism in your heart to believe the system can be better. So time has not yet ground you down into being a pessimist. Patient advocates are ones that I am not so optimistic about for a few reasons. One, many of their advocacy organizations are just empty storefronts for the industry. They receive the primary funding from the industry. But patients, I am optimistic about. Real patients in our countries, in rural areas. If we can reach them and bring out what they want. So I guess I'd say, like any movement where the movement is reinforcing because the people who benefit are entrenched powers, you need a broad coalition of the young, of the vulnerable, of stakeholders like patients to put pressure on people in power to take action. So I applaud your question. I think it's the only way forward. I mean, it's the only thing I know to do with my time.
And certainly one problem that you face, well, indeed in Britain and in the States, is that the financial consequences of kind of extortionately high drug prices are often a couple of steps away from the consumer, whether it's via Medicare spending and indirectly taxes or your insurance contributions. So actually recognising the effect on you personally of these policies can be quite difficult.
I mean, that's so astute, which is that one of the great ways the broken system perpetuates itself is that the person who is being screwed over, who's feeling the brunt of who's feeling the sharp edge of the blade, they don't know who's holding the blade. The system is built in a way that the average person, they are suffering from these prices. How are they suffering? Their income has stagnated for decades in this country. Income inequality is at a record high. There's a great social unrest and dissatisfaction. And the easy thing is, charismatic nationalist people can take that energy and transform it into the wrong aims. People can easily be tricked to believe that it's some other group. It's somebody, it's an immigrant perhaps that's the result of your woes. They don't see it's the entrenched policies that do the damage. You're right. I think so much of why politics is the way it is this precise issue that we have, I think, stagnated the middle class and stagnated the working poor. We've put them in an impossible pressure cooker situation. They know they're being squeezed. They just don't know how and why they're being squeezed. And then politicians come along and tell them a fairy tale and take their vote and then perpetuate the problem. That's the problem with Western democracies.
Do you think that this is an American issue to solve. And by that, I mean that the American pharmaceutical sector and the pharmaceutical market is so enormous that lots of the trials carried out and lots of the research carried out is geared towards providing data for American regulatory improvement. Is this, short of collecting better data in other countries, can regulators there and can organisations there really apply any pressure? Or do you think that a pharmaceutical company would turn around and say, actually, do you know what, the British market, if it wants to set a higher bar for drugs, then it's a bit of a casualty. We can afford to cut that loose because the profits aren't necessarily there.
Yes, America will always do the right thing after it has exhausted all the other options. That's what a wise man once said. And it's true here that I think you're hitting on something very key, which is that you need America to reform itself. You need it in the UK. Western Europe needs America to reform itself. The American market for healthcare is so large, consumes so much resources, sets so much of the global agenda that until we do reformation, you can never have the ability to negotiate the way you could if a nation of 300 million people was also lobbying for lower drug prices and these things, raising the bar. I think the industry may easily cut out any single Western European nation that chooses to set a higher bar. However, that said, just because you need the US to come along doesn't mean that you're powerless. Just imagine, even in countries of Western Europe, you spend so much money on healthcare. Imagine if the UK Cancer Drug Fund once upon a time did what Ben Goldacre suggested they do. If we're going to fund these drugs with low evidence base, let's do it in the context of a randomized control trial measuring survival. We're going to bring it to the UK, but we're going to fund a randomized control trial. We're going to give it to the first 1,000 people with kidney cancer, and we're going to see if it improves mortality. You publish your study, and then you can maybe debunk practice in the US. So I think that the governments of Western Europe have potential to do the studies that change practice in the US. And you might have to do a few of them, sort of throw a bucket of ice water in our face and this side of the pond to get us to do the right thing. Americans will do the right thing, but it is only after they exhausted other options. And so, but you can help us exhaust those options.
Perhaps it's also fair to say that America might do the right thing if it sees other countries doing the right thing as well. There's certainly kind of international jockeying for positions and, oh, Germany is doing so-and-so, such and such with their testing out, for example, we need to do that as well. And I think there's probably something to be said for countries feeling like they're being left behind in regulations if other countries have taken what is clearly seen as a beneficial step in that direction. And it really hints at the idea also that evidence from a single trial can provide evidence for the entire world.
Yes, you're right. I think that evidence from low and middle income nations showed us that removing the primary cancer and breast cancer after it's metastatic did not improve survival. That was a paper from Tata in Mumbai, India. And that can affect the world. Nations that don't have the resources of the United States with simple randomized control trials can provide information that changes global practice. And I think it's a mistake to think otherwise, to think that these nations that even not wealthy nations are powerless. They're very powerful if they are pushed in the right direction. And I guess I would say that the challenge is, of course, that it's so easy to copy what the US does. I mean, the US right now in cancer medicine, we're doing whole exome sequencing on all these patients. It's easy to say that if we want to be the leader, we should also offer whole exome sequencing. The harder thing to say is, why don't we randomize cancer patients to whole exome sequencing or not and look to see if there's an improvement in survival? But those are the right ways to change the model. Don't just emulate what the US does. Put the US practice to the test. It's likely that what we're doing is wasteful in many cases. And perhaps not that, but perhaps so. Who knows?
It's interesting, the other side of this question, which is we're talking about providing some floodgates for drugs that have not yet been approved to get into the system. But yet there are probably quite a few ones there are in there that have got in on dubious evidence as well and seem to be very difficult to remove. How do you think we can go about siphoning out some of the more problematic interventions that we have out there? Particularly, we talk about the idea of equipoise and the idea that people won't want to be randomised to a placebo arm of a drug that has ostensibly been proven to work. Do you see a kind of a way forwards in de-weeding the garden, as it were?
It's a great question. I mean, I guess there's two parts to your question. One is, do we need a clinical trials agenda of things that are already in widespread use that may have come to use based on lousy evidence and may in fact not work? And I say yes. Tamiflu is the great example. We had the great study in the BMJ with the reanalysis. There's something called value of information theory. That's a great way to prioritize these practices. What that means is you focus on things that are that have high aggregate societal spending. That a lot of people, it's being done, and there's a huge amount of spending that are very costly, very invasive, that have real toxicities, that have lousy evidence base, and where the providers are amenable to reason that if you brought this data, that they would stop. So that's the value of information theory. That's how you prioritize what to test. But you're asking a separate question, which is, do we have a problem? Do people not really get randomization? They not get equipoise? And I think, yeah, that's a huge problem. People believe, even doctors, that medicine is a series of incremental advances. And that's why we did so much work on reversal to show that, another Churchill quote, history is written by the victors. Medical textbooks are written to create the illusion that medicine was always this logical progression to where we are now, because it's written by the victors. But medicine is a series of missteps, of false starts, of things that went nowhere. Those don't make the modern textbooks. Those stories get lost because, there's only so much. It's already 4,000 pages. Who can, read any more than that? So part of what we do in the reversal work is to remind us that we constantly see these missteps. And the more you understand missteps, the more you understand how smart people, charismatic people who believe something would have worked, turned out it didn't work, the more you understand that, the more you yourself become amenable to randomization as a tool to figure out what works or not. I've seen a number of surveys that suggest that if a doctor would give a red pill or a blue pill, and they give it at random, there's no logic to when they give it, the patient's happy to get a red pill or a blue pill, but they'll be damned if they'll be randomized to that. That is really, that expresses something that the average person doesn't really understand. Why are we doing randomized studies? What was their purpose? Were there ever things that we thought that everyone was like, that's gotta work, and then somebody did a randomized study and they're like, oh my goodness, it doesn't work? And the answer is yeah, but the average person doesn't know those stories. So I think you gotta become familiar with a history that doesn't make the textbooks. And to a large degree, that's why we wrote that book, Medical Reversal, Ending Medical Reversal, to teach people that these things happen, and maybe it'll give you a different take on randomization. Just one more thing. Sometimes people ask me, Paul, somebody said on the internet that there should be a randomized trial of wearing a mask versus wearing a face shield when you go to the grocery store in the US. Right now we have mandatory mask laws. And this person said, okay, that sounds great, but would you actually be randomized to wearing a face shield, no mask? Would you? And I guess my answer is, yeah, of course I would. Are you kidding me? We don't know. There's good reasons to think one might be better than the other, but maybe we're wrong. I would happily be randomized to mask or face shield or whatever you want me to be randomized to. I'm not the expert in all the preclinical science, but yeah, I'll be randomized. Why would I be so comfortable being randomized? Because I've read so many randomized trials that went the way I didn't expect. So, if you come to me and, you've done a surgery one way and you want to randomize to a different way or not doing it, I'm game. I'm game for lots of things personally, because I know that historically, when people do these studies, you don't always get what you expect.
My first thought on this was, and something you really drove home in any medical reversal, is that the logical is not necessarily the correct. Perhaps one reason that we fall into this trap is we don't really randomise lots of the things that we do in kind of everyday life that we think are so intuitive and must be correct. Because we can see a clear kind of mechanistic explanation for it. And I think this idea that actually the human body and medicine is not necessarily as simple as our model suggests in its current stage, perhaps is why actually so many things that you've explained with Adam Sifu that seem to be almost infallible in terms of we do X, which causes Y, which therefore improves Z.
I always come to this point, which is that, somebody who has toddlers in their house doesn't buy a coffee table with very sharp edges. To my knowledge, there's not been a randomized trial that shows that having the sharp coffee table is worse than having putting those things on the end of the coffee table. But, the mechanistic makes sense. And we've seen kids run into the coffee table and get a gash in their forehead. But that same thing is not true for interdicting on the neprilysin inhibition in heart failure. Where the pathways are much more complex than we expect, where the effect sizes are much smaller. And there are things in life we don't ask randomized trials, like, for instance, how often do I go to the movie theater? Because that's really about your money, your pleasure. But in healthcare, we're spending all of our money. We're spending all of our money because we believe this is a societal good. So I think we have a higher obligation to know that the way we spend all our money actually achieves what we wish it achieved, which is our societal good. If we spend all our money on devices that don't make people live longer, we really are running a welfare program for device makers. we're giving them a charitable contribution. That's a misallocation, but society doesn't benefit. So it's really sort of we're consolidating wealth in the hands of shareholders. Society doesn't benefit. That's what I think a lot of healthcare is that when you don't have the evidence, you're just redistributing wealth in a maladaptive way, in a way that goes against proper distribution of wealth. But go on.
I think an important question that we have to face up to is that we can't test everything in the randomized controlled trial. We can't do everything and test all of our interventions. Well, perhaps we can test our interventions, but we can't test all of the policy things we do. We can't test whether, if you come into the east entrance of the hospital or the west entrance, whether you are in a better mood when you get to the wards. But there are certain things we do need to draw the line somewhere. But actually, particularly your example of going to the movies actually highlights the point that particularly trials that are set to benefit a very large number of people are certainly much more interesting for us to actually run, given their scalability in this case.
This value of information theory is the great way to prioritize. You're right. Not only, we can't test everything, but we can't even test all the interventions, to be honest with you, because there's just too many interventions. So we do need a way to prioritize and test things first. And I think we have to look at aggregate societal spending. Things that we spend as a society, $100 billion, we should test more quickly than $10 billion at the same levels of evidence. You know what I mean? We should test things that are more invasive, more harmful, which have greater complications, which have more blood loss, things that people pay more out of pocket, societies pay more than what people pay out of pocket. So there is sort of, I think, a rational framework, and that's how we should prioritize testing. Things we stockpile versus things we don't stockpile. So I think you're right, though. But we'll never test everything. But the way we are now is we test nearly nothing rigorously, and we test nearly nothing again once it's on the market.
This low-hanging fruit is testing some of the big fish out there, and then we can worry about actually reaching perhaps this kind of watershed moment when it gets there, when we get to there, or if we get to there. And also the idea that we can't test every intervention in every context as well, and in every patient group. And there needs to be some degree with which we can apply the evidence that we have to groups that aren't exactly identical to the study group in the trial. Yeah. But that doesn't necessarily preclude making sure that we test, for example, an anti-cancer drug in a group who's representative of age rather than in healthy 30-year-olds who are likely to live longer. That's the low-hanging fruit in this case.
So well put. I mean, I think that you're right. You can never test an intervention under every circumstance. But then again, it would be nice to know it works under some circumstance. And we have a lot of interventions that we have never proven works under any circumstance. So that's one thing. Two, it would be nice if our trials became a little more pragmatic. Patients were more representative of socioeconomic diversity, the age diversity of this country, of your country. It would be nice if they were. Will it ever be, applicable to every single person? Maybe not. There'll always be some extrapolation, but I don't think we should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We could become better. So what stops us from doing that? But we might never be perfect, as you point.
It seems like we're on the definitely the upward slope of the exponential curve. We're not at the plateau yet.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Another question that I had leading on from this, and I'm aware of time, but was the idea, again, when we've been talking a bit about running a trial in a smaller population of people in order to benefit a larger population. And when we talk about interventions out there on the market that are potentially disadvantageous towards patients or at best ineffective, could we imagine ourselves in a scenario where there might be, say, an 80-20 probability that an intervention is effective and good for a patient? For that patient and for that trial group, the placebo arm could be seen, there might not necessarily be seen as equipoise in this scenario. That actually a patient would very understandably want to have that treatment because the chances are in favour of it being effective. But when we talk about thousands and potentially millions of other people out there in the population who could benefit from good evidence, from shifting that 80-20 probability towards some other end and weeding out the interventions that are bad, this seems like a bit of a conundrum.
I see what you're saying. I guess I would say two things. So one is what you're really kind of hitting at is equipoise a prerequisite for randomized controlled trials? And I think you have articulated nicely that it ought to be, and it ought to be a 50-50 sort of equipoise. I think, of course, there's a literature on this, and people have debated, does the equipoise need to exist in each individual clinician? Is it a collective equipoise? Is it 50-50? The other thing you need to know about the debate is there are people, Franklin Miller, Steve Joffe, who've written in the New England Journal, that equipoise is neither necessary nor sufficient for randomized trials. It's neither here nor there. So there's a really beautiful paper called Equipoise and the Dilemma of Randomized Trials by Joffe Miller. I encourage you to read, because I think maybe there's some people out there who don't think that that's a prerequisite. Okay, so that's part of the background. The other thing I would say in this space is that you have an intervention that you think is 80-20. I guess what I would push you a little bit on is, how do you know it's 80-20? I think that there is a huge interest in Bayesian inference, and I'm a big supporter, and I've had Bayesians on my podcast, and I'm learning from them. I think we have to recognize, however, that there is no book, a textbook that says this intervention, let's say IVC filter, is that 50-50? Is it 20-80? Is it 80-20? What is it? I've looked at the evidence. I say the evidence is total garbage, totally garbage evidence. I mean, it's the garbage upon garbage. It should never have been approved. It's used hundreds of thousands of times. You need a randomized trial. I would say in a really well done study, I would say it's, the pretest probability it's going to work is like 1%, half of 1%, if you ask me. But somebody else might say 50-50. Somebody else might say 80-20. How do we really know? And I guess I would say that the empirical science of assigning that probability is harder than people let on, even when you do have a single randomized control trial, because all those sort of estimates are in some part leveraged on pretest probability, which is there's no book. People say they use a flat probability, but even a flat probability might be an assumption that's not true. Maybe the true assumption is there's a spike on null, and the spike is the size of Mount Everest. I mean, who knows? So I guess I would say, that. I mean, I see where you're coming from. That one can imagine, how do you handle these situations where you lean some way? And we all, as doctors, lean some way. I have a lot of things I do. I lean some way. I believe it works often. I'm an oncologist, have to. I think the ways you handle that are, you ask, do we really need equipoise? Does it have to be in the clinicians? Does it have to be in the group? And the next way you ask it is equipoise necessary? And then the other way you ask is, how do we really know those probabilities? And so I'm not really answering your question, but I guess just food for thought.
Yeah, that's certainly a great framework for thinking about it. Yeah, interesting. The IVC filter is a great example of something that seems fantastically logical in what it does, and then is later proven to be ineffective.
Yes, in the majority of studies to date, ineffective and untested in a lot of indications where people believe that it must work. So you do a randomized trial here, and you say it doesn't work under these circumstances, and then they say, well, you didn't test it here, you didn't test it here, you didn't test it here. And I'd like to say that medical devices and drugs, you can never prove it doesn't work under every circumstance. You should prove it does work under some circumstance.
Yes.
That's the falsifiability claim of science. Yeah.
And that's the really important thing for a patient, because it's not really, when you're making a medical decision, you're not saying that, it could work. You're saying, actually, we've shown that it works in people similar to you, and that is why you should yourself use it.
The best case scenario, let's talk about the best case scenario. The best case scenario is, we know that on average for people like you, this has an average net expected benefit. On average. That's the best case scenario. We never know for an individual that you will be helped or you will be hurt. We just know on average for people like you live longer if you do this or not. And so we know if you practice in that way, the best case way, on average, you're making the world a better place. Is it possible that somebody's going to have Steven Johnson's when you give them a drug and you could hasten death in one case? Yeah, that's true. But on average, you're making the world a better place. That's the best case scenario. So I think that's the challenge of medicine.
Medicine is so much about probabilities, and there's so much that we don't know, and this idea of complete certainty is a bit of a fallacy, particularly when you're talking about an individual patient.
Of course. I think that's it's remarkable to hear you're a third-year medical student, and you've come to one of the things that many people don't learn, I think, before they retire, is that's the fact that medicine is a lot of probability and a lot of uncertainty. And the sooner you realize that, the better you off.
When we talk about probability and p-values, there's this worry that things can slip through the net that are not effective but have just reached that threshold of p equals 0.95. And John Ioannidis, in his classic paper, Why Most Medical Research is Wrong, I think I'm paraphrasing it there, but
no, you're right.
Hits upon this. One thing that stands out for me is certainly when I think about neurodegenerative diseases, and which do, I know you've had a go at this idea of unmet need, but certainly there is an unmet need here for something. And anything that does come along, for example, for Alzheimer's, could suddenly capture billions of dollars and tens of billions, hundreds of billions probably in the worldwide market, and actually be very tricky to take out of kind of entrenched clinical practice. And I think that's probably something we have to be slightly concerned about, particularly when we've got multiple testing going on across even the same classes of drugs.
Let's talk about that. That's a great example, Alzheimer's. So right now in the UK and in the US and every country on earth, there are some people who suffer from end-stage severe dementia Alzheimer's. They may not even know their name. They don't recognize people. They don't know where they are. I mean, that's the state. That's severe Alzheimer's. It relates to evidence. So let's say I make a drug for severe Alzheimer's and I give it to 3 people, and all 3 people immediately are lucid. They remember who they are. They say, oh my gosh, I've been like imprisoned in my body for all these years. I feel clear now. I know who you are. What year is it? Tell me about what's going on. Oh my God, thank you so much. I feel so much better. And they start talking to you. They're 100% restored. We will never ask for a randomized trial for that. That's a parachute level intervention. We'll never ask for a randomized trial. After 3 people, 10 people, that drug will be approved and be given to everybody with severe Alzheimer's, right? There'll never be a study of that drug. It's going to be so transformational. The effect size is going to be so big.
So whereas actually we would ask for much more evidence if, for example, 10% of Alzheimer's patients each year, or 20%, suddenly did click like that anyway, by chance. And they just suddenly something happened. Maybe it was
exactly.
Maybe something like that.
Exactly.
The fact that that is such a rare occurrence in Alzheimer's patients, a progressive condition where people do not flick like a light switch over a couple of months, they might fluctuate in terms of symptoms, is something that kind of defines the evidence of effect size that we would be looking for, and the trial size that we'd want.
Yes, exactly. And so now, you're totally spot on. It's that the natural history, it does wax and wane, but it steadily deteriorates. There is no light switch drug. In the advanced stages, if there's a light switch moment, that's going to be front page news on every newspaper. But let's talk about the reality of drug development. Is that what the drug developers are doing? They're not doing that. They're going into mild Alzheimer's. People who, score with mild early Alzheimer's, score, slightly off on certain tests, may even be able to function and be okay in their life still today. They still are okay. And then what's the endpoint they want to chase? Not that end stage outcome. They want to look at, do they improve on a questionnaire, on a score, on a crossword puzzle? Do they improve statistically significant? And so when you get into that endpoint, that's very modest endpoint. That's the dimmer switch, barely turning. Now you run 100 randomized control trials. Now you take a lot of drugs that may or may not work. Some by chance alone are going to be positive, and they will have billion-dollar market share. They'll be very difficult to pull back. So I guess the fact we chase small effect sizes relates to all the standards of evidence and the cost of the drug. I mean, all these things are interwoven. But we can imagine that transformational drug, and whoever does that will be a global hero, a Nobel laureate. But that's not where we are right now. We're chasing these crossword puzzle-like scores to improve them very modestly.
And I guess what I'd say is that chasing mild Alzheimer's isn't necessarily a bad thing in itself. There's a school of thought that looks at it and says, actually, we need to be targeting beta amyloid neurofibrillary tangles early on in the disease, and therefore we need to start early when effects are mild. But that doesn't give justification for not testing that properly for a clinical endpoint that we're actually interested in, which I think was your point that you really clearly made there.
No. You're absolutely right. There is potentially a biological basis to do that, but that doesn't justify the lack of endpoint. But then the other thing I would say is that sometimes potentially that biological basis is overstated. So the same thing is said in cancer. We cannot treat multi-drug resistant cancer. Ergo, we must intervene very, very early. But perhaps some of that is true, but perhaps some of that is overstated. So I think, I think it's the two edges of the sword, but that none of that justifies a bad endpoint in the study.
A number of failed phase 3 trials for Alzheimer's for targeting the beta amyloid cascade have put into question actually whether our biological understanding of it is sufficient enough to attack it from a purely kind of mechanistic point of view at this current stage.
Yes.
Now, I'm conscious for time right here. So to bring things all together, if you could, if you were put in a position actually where, although you've got a lot of sway with the Plenary Session podcast, if you had even more, let's say all around legislators amongst medical educators, what would be the number 1 and number 2 changes that you would like to see happen immediately within the system? What would you say is the low-hanging fruit of the current system that we have around trial design and regulation, for example?
Okay. I mean, I guess I'd say, maybe I'll just hit it really quickly across broad domains. I guess I'd say drug regulators in the US, I've written the book Malignant, and it talks about a lot of, they have existing statutory authority to raise the standards for drug approvals and all those things. Those could be immediately implemented. We can negotiate drug price in the US, put downward pressure on the market that will help the world. Medical education. Medical education needs to be dynamited and rebuilt again. I mean, medical education is the vestige of prior medical education. Tons of mechanistic body understanding, very little statistics, epidemiology, regulation, science, thinking about interpreting evidence, making sense in practice, decision-making under uncertainty. I would flip that whole thing on its head, and I've written a paper called The Encounter-Based Curriculum that does that, and it's also discussed in the book. Students, I think, students are good. I mean, the students are wonderful who go into medical education. We should do a better job of training them. The residency years, it can't just be an exploitative labor force. It has to be geared to educating people to become better. In the US, it's pretty much a free labor force that occasionally learns things in passing. It should be the other way around. It should be primarily education, and we should have more staff do the heavy work there. All the money we could save from not approving useless products could be spent on adequate staffing. Ironically, in medicine, we are loved to pay money for products, but not for people. And then lastly, academic faculty needs serious reforms for interactions with the industry and for conflict of interest. And if you do those things, I think you're already leaps and bounds better than the current system.
I was thinking this idea of reforming medical education and almost how we've talked a lot about evidence and evidence for interventions. I was thinking how we would get the evidence for reforming medical education, because a randomized trial it's hard to define even what a good doctor is, and let alone measure it. So a randomized trial of a certain kind of alteration to a medical education system that takes 20 years to complete, and it's hard to measure the endpoints of whether you're making a better clinician, and is even harder when you think actually we probably want to train different doctors to do different things and have different specialties as well. Do you think there are any steps we can make towards changing it that almost encompass the values that we're trying to instill in the medical education system itself?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I guess I would say, one hypothesis to offer you is that maybe it shouldn't be subject to the same sort of levels of evidence as drugs and devices, for the simple reason, no part of education, to my knowledge, is subject to randomized trials, from teaching the alphabet to mathematics, trigonometry, to preclinical science, to working in a lab, to learning why the tree has roots, to why the leaves. None of that has randomized data to my knowledge. So that's what's it. And the current system is based on 100% historical accident. So I think to some degree, you might be justified in saying, look, we know the kind of doctor we want, an always learning doctor, critical thinker, epidemiology, statistics. We need these things. We'll start by adding those things in, and we'll see how much space we have for preclinical science. We can build it that way, and maybe you don't need a trial. But that said, I think that you're onto something, and we should leverage trials insofar as possible. What do I think the gold standard is? The gold standard is you get a bunch of people who are good doctors, and it'll be a bit subjective, but I will tell you who I would put in that bucket. And the gold standard of being a doctor is when you finish your residency training, that I'm just on your shoulder for a week in your life. I follow you for a week in your life, and I see, how does he talk to patients? How does he talk through these decisions? How does he think about new drugs? How does he, I just shadow you. And at the end of the week, I say, you know what? Here's what you did good. Here's what you did bad. Here's what I would improve on. Okay, that's what I think is maybe, and it's not just me. It's 10 of me, right? It's 10 of me who do it, and we aggregate the score. And we pick people who, study these things and who care about making the right medical decisions. We pick those types of people. And then we do that for all the colleagues. So I guess what I want to say is, sometimes the gold standard assessment of being a doctor is very, very costly to do. Maybe it's possible, maybe it's not possible. But I tend to believe it might be possible. But the biggest barrier is nobody wants to buy a week of my time to have me really, and that's the problem with medical education, is that, I don't know about your experience, but in my experience, I never once in my entire medical education has an attending watched me take a history and physical. I don't think that's ever happened. Maybe a senior resident watched me, but never once. And a real patient, a real history and physical, a real, a standardized patient, yes, they've been an observer, but real scenario, never. I don't think the amount of times I've worked and actually gotten to shadow a senior person, very, very limited. I mean, we only see medicine by presentation. We don't really see how our colleagues really do the work. And maybe that's what it takes to really sort out who's doing a good job or who's doing a bad job. No, the goal of medical education is not, in my opinion, to decide who's better, they're not. It's to take everyone and move them on the bell curve to being a better doctor. That's what I think the goal is.
Absolutely.
Not the evaluation.
Absolutely. And it seems like a strange system where if you're going to take thousands and thousands of medical histories throughout your career, then surely a few at the beginning, a little bit of investment at the beginning in actually having an attending there to watch you do it and give you some tips on it is almost a drop in the ocean of the resources that are being used to train you and the potential benefit that comes in the future.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it does not necessarily have to be approached the same way as drug interventions where society is shouldering the payment burden, all these things. But it doesn't mean that it can't be studied. It can be studied. And you're right. And the more we study it, the better off we'll be. And you're right. And maybe, you asked me in the heat of the moment, I haven't had time to think about it, but I'm going to think about it probably in the next few weeks. And if you got a lot of creative people together, I bet you could study it. And in fact, we should study it. You're right. I think you're onto something.
I think that'd be a perfect way to end this with an eye towards the future. So, Vinay, thank you so much for joining with me. It's been a real pleasure, really deep-reaching conversation. And I'd point everybody towards Malignant, Annual Podcast, and Ending Medical Reversal because they're all fantastic for thinking about some of these issues in even more depth. And they're where I got some of the ideas that I brought up here from.
Well, I want to thank you so much for having me. It's been a wonderful conversation. And, you're like a decade ahead of where I was when I was in your shoes. Like you're light years ahead. So I'm like super optimistic that the future's in good hands. And, you're a marvelous interviewer and you did your homework and you have great questions and you're thinking so sharp. And so it's really a pleasure for me too. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a lovely rest of your day in San Francisco. Take care.
Get some rest. Yeah, take care.
Will do. Thanks for listening to the Pager Podcast. If you've enjoyed it, do leave us a review, share it with a friend, and come back to listen to our other episodes. As ever, we'd love to hear what you think. You can reach us at Pager Podcast on Instagram and Twitter, or email us at pagerpodcast@gmail.com. Bye for now.